Good to see you all. Today we have the honor of having Professor Allon, the director of the Jerome Fisher Program in Management and Technology at Wharton, as the first ever Hexite podcast guest. We're joining us today also is Tamar Weiser, the CEO of Hexite, and we'll of course hear all about God's record and how we ended up in this room together. I'm the head of sales at Hexite. You could look at that as a dirty term, or you could say that I like to connect, understand customers' problems, and propose a solution. But that in mind, Tamar, please.
Thank you, Jameson. Gadis, you've established yourself as a leading expert in decision science. You've published dozens of papers on the topic. And of course, you have your insightful newsletter. Tell us a bit more about your work so far.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. Originally from Israel, that's where I grew up. Went to the Technion, the Israeli Institute of Technology, studied operation research, worked for a few startups in technology as a software developer, but then moved to the US and did my PhD here at Columbia. Was for 11 years at the Kellogg School, and that's where I started working on supply chain problems. Not only I worked on several different issues, but I started working on supply chain primarily prompted by different projects that I've done. I worked with PepsiCo on a project, worked with John Deere, with GM. But then when I moved to Wharton as the director of the management technology program, continued to work with firms primarily as they scale, trying to scale their supply chain, trying to deal with primarily global supply chains in different areas and industries. And stuff like most of my publications are really about decision-making processes, how people make decisions with more information, less information. But a lot of that is being also on global supply chains. And a lot of my work is being on supply chain.
So in today's environment, seeing decades of companies try to reinvent supply chain management, are companies actually healthier? Do their service level and margins improve? Tell us a bit what you see in the market today.
Yeah, so we have to first of all start by acknowledging that the last few years have been really hard for supply chains, and we can actually start probably and first of all acknowledge that the word supply chain is fairly recent. I mean, I think people have done logistics work and warehousing and things like that for decades, but supply chain is really an issue of the last 2 decades, and the last 5 years specifically have been really hard. When I say really hard, I mean COVID, and then tariffs, and now you have issues around climate and geopolitical aspects beyond that. I mean, wars in different places. And one of the main issues that I see in supply chain that everybody is preparing always for the last crisis. So like immediately after COVID, everybody started talking about resilience and how do we build resilience, only to realize that they really have very little understanding of their supply chain. And so that I don't think supply chains these days are healthier. I don't think they are actually run better. I think there is different trade-offs that people are unwilling to make, and I'm happy to go deeper into this topic. But by and large, I don't think we have better run supply chains now than we had, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago.
But even with all of the information and big data that's been collected over, call it the last 20 years, and the flow of information has improved, but what's getting in the way of improvements in supply chain?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'll start from a very strategic level and say that, I just spoke this week with a fairly big firm. I cannot say the name, but it's a fairly big firm in the area of snacks and drinks. While from the top there is a mandate to become more resilient, there is always pressure on margins. So on the one side, the firm wants to achieve a 99.9 service level. At the same time, the product that they sell have a very, very, I think customers are very, very sensitive to prices. You cannot achieve both. You either build a resilient supply chain, or you build a cost-efficient supply chain, a responsive supply chain, or a cost-efficient supply chain. And if there is no realization from leadership that you cannot do both, the people that run supply chain will continuously play defense on both sides. So that's the first thing. The second thing is most supply chain data is unstructured. It's unstructured in a sense that it's not like a nicely tabulated data that sits somewhere in the CRM, but actually it's data that a lot of that is in paper. A lot of that is in people's head. And many of that run by Excel. Give an example, Apple. The Apple that we all know run their supply chain in Excel. And so this is actually exactly the thing that when you want to run big data, you run into the fact that the main bottleneck is the fact that the data is actually not available. But then you go one step deeper, which is, okay, I have the data, but now I need to make decisions. And a lot of what we've seen over the last 20 years is, there is more algorithmic work, but a lot of the work is primarily dashboarding. Nothing annoys me more in life than just dashboards, because ultimately the people look at these dashboards and say, I have amazing data, but okay, what does that mean for me? I'll give an example. One of the terms we hear a lot is digital twins, is the ability to actually see how the world is shaped. But if I don't really make different decisions, or I don't really know how to translate it into a decision. What do I use actually? How can I use all this information? So it's really from very strategic level all the way to the bottom. We don't really know how to, or at least we know, academically how to use this data, but that really never trickled into the firms making better decisions.
So the bottleneck then is that this is not necessarily putting the data in the same place or refining it. Once you actually do that, how does it influence decisions? And you gave the example of a digital twin. Is there any impact that you might see downstream within a supply chain?
Yeah, I'll say that to me at least the big difficulty is in closing the loop, right? You outline multiple things, right? The first step is I need to get the data. Second thing, I need to refine the data. Then I need to put it in a place where I can actually build models based on that. Then I need people to implement these. Then I need to go back and say, okay, was the implementation good enough? So I can now, what part of this model that do I need to refine? I'll give an example. Many firms over the last few years spent a lot of time trying to improve forecasting. But I improve forecasting, but if this forecasting actually doesn't really generate better decisions, or in fact, the forecast becomes very volatile to the world where, I'll give an example. During COVID, Walmart has a very simple system that allows store managers to actually use big data and AI to make better decisions. And somewhere along the lines, in the middle of COVID, getting out of COVID already, they told their store manager they can override these. And the reason they did it was that they ran into significant shortages in their stores. Shortages on one side and significant excess inventory of other aspects. And then why was that the case? A lot of that was the fact that here you have an event that was unexpected, and the system just doesn't know how to address that.
Right.
And so how do you build systems? That goes back to my point about resilience and cost efficiency. You can build systems that are very, very good in cost efficiency. You can build systems that are very resilient. It's very hard to do both. And resilient in particular doesn't mean that we are ready for it's a hotter days than yesterday. That most systems know how to do that. But what if now there is a supplier that actually go bankrupt? And I realized that supplier is a supplier that I wasn't even aware that my suppliers buy from. What do I do then? Or now I have 100% tariffs on a key component to one of my products, right? So the system of these are not robust enough. And since we're not closing the loop on all of these, we're sort of these systems are actually evolving in the blind.
Well, that is a great point, is that many forecasts that are meant to address this kind of volatility actually assume quite a lot of certainty. When there's so much volatility and essentially all these systems are trying to assign certainty to something that is inherently uncertain, which is the future, right? So why is that such a rooted business strategy? Even we've come back to the last 5 years of changes. Why is that such a hard-coded assumption that so many things will be certain?
It's a great question. I would say it's a great question, because I would say most people that do forecasting will tell you, no, we're forecasting the uncertainty. And you're making exactly the right point, which is I don't think most of us understand how much certainty we have built into our uncertain models. I'll give an example. If you look at the tariffs now, and I think it's just that's not the main point of discussion, but I think it's just a good example for that. Firms ask me what's going to happen. What do you think the world is going to be? And I said, well, there are basically 3 worlds that can emerge. One, we're back to the status quo. That's one. Second one, we're in a world where we are absolutely regionalized supply chain, right? Everything that has 100% tariffs on everything, completely regionalized. Another option is we're completely free trade, no tariffs whatsoever. This intimidation worked. If you now ask me to assign probability to each one, I don't know, but I know that each one of them is possible. And I think that's really what true volatility or uncertainty is. What we hear a lot of most of the forecasting model, they're trying to assign a probability to that. And since they fail, they say basically what we're going to focus is on what's the likelihood tomorrow the order can actually increase. So what's the likelihood that the demand is going to increase next month, which is to a large extent a much narrower subset of problems and a much narrower set of actions. But these are actually the actions that the systems can run by themselves. So I think firms are really unable at this point to think about things that are deeply, deeply uncertain. Because I think what they lack is exactly the point you made, which is I think they don't appreciate how much certainty there is in their models.
Would you say that's the biggest systemic mistake that a company makes, or is there something even greater that we're missing?
No, I think that's one big one. I think the second one, which if I go back to the forecasting point, firms overinvest in forecasting, and I know it may sound weird that I'm saying that. What emerged over the last few years is the idea of something called a decision-aware forecasting, which basically says, know that ultimately the goal is not to forecast. the goal is to drive, if I go back to your point, higher service level, lower margins, a higher margin, right? That's my goal. The goal is a business goal, not a technology goal. And by over-investing in forecasting that then feeds into a decision that by this connection is flawed, then what you get is firms basically either have too much capacity or too much inventory or not enough inventory because things that they could have potentially built a system for, but they over-invested in trying to get this kind of like a very, very narrow forecast that just is not very robust to any changes. Now, I'll say that there is another issue, which is, I think, firms, and that's I'll go back a little bit to the point about dashboarding. Managers like control. And so they like to see the information in front of them. And so a lot of the information, a lot of the research, a lot of the work of the last few years has been creating better dashboards so people can actually see what's going on. But then they ask themselves, what's the ROI on that? And the ROI is very low because, okay, the fact that I can see all this information really doesn't empower me to make better decisions because a lot of this information is really not actionable. So I think that's, to me at least, like when I see firms have very fancy dashboards, my question is like, if you see overall supply chain technology has been lagging on many other areas, and part of that is because of how dirty the data is, but also a lot of that is because a lot of the work is being on better BI or better business intelligence rather than on better decisions.
Just seeing it can feel like a solution, but ultimately, if it doesn't drive a decision or make a decision better, then what is it really doing?
Exactly.
Let's invert the question though. What companies are handling volatility really well? What's differentiating them?
I'll try not to name names, but I'll say it's primarily those that understand that resilience comes at a cost, and where building this resilience becomes an integral part of multiple layers. So I'll give an example. I usually think about that as of like a whole spectrum between being reactive to being resilient. And reactive means everything is new, everything that something happens, you say, oh, I really didn't see that coming, and you react to that. So you're continuously in firefighting mode. The other side of that, which are resilient firms. And resilient firms, people say, okay, we're just going to become more resilient. No, it requires leadership to be aware of that. It requires leadership to understand the trade-offs. Then it requires you to map. Most firms understand who's their tier one supplier, but I cannot tell you how many times. Like every time I speak with a firm, they tell me about the incident they just had where they realized that two tier one suppliers that were supposed to hedge against each other are sourcing from exactly the same tier 2 supplier. And they were not aware of that until a crisis. So these are firms that actually have better supply chain mapping are in better shape. Then firms that also understand at any point in time, what's the economics of that? Right? So not only what's the technological solution, but what's the value at risk? What's the value of, if there is a key, what's the revenue at risk if things happen? And also have the tools to do that. And when I say tools, it can be product tools, so switching between products, can be financial tools. Many times the solution is financial, to go and provide the cash infusion to the supplier, right? But these are firms that they view supply chain risk and resilience as an end-to-end solution rather than as a fragmented solution in every step. And there are firms that are going in that direction, but it takes years to do that and requires consistently for managers to understand it's only a technological solution, even though technology is the bread and butter of that, but requires many, many layers of understanding on top of that.